Over the past 4 years, there has been a 41% year-on-year growth in Salesforce architect roles in the job market. But as well as deep platform knowledge, the number one soft skill that every employer is asking for is communication. My name is Kevin White, and I'm the head of Salesforce architecture in the UK for Capgemini. But when I started out on my architecture journey, at first the responsibility seemed daunting. I understood the Salesforce platform, I knew how to build apps, but I didn't know how to document them. I didn't know how to mature my designs or how to communicate them to my stakeholders. So I was really fortunate to work with experienced architects who taught me repeatable tools and methods that I still use today. So I'm really pleased to be here today to discuss 5 of those crucial tools that I believe every architect should have in their kit bag. And as well as the tools themselves, I want to explore what does it mean that we've created them? How do we communicate it? And what are the key messages for our stakeholders? From a personal point of view, being a Salesforce architect has been the best role I've had in technology. You get to work with this great platform and ecosystem. You can be creative and you need to stay in the detail. But most importantly, through technology, you'll be pivotal to change in your organizations and you'll open doors for yourself along the way. So before we get into the first tool, it's time to think like an architect. Well, what is an architect in the general sense? Well, a software architect is there to design the solution and design the solution in accordance with best practice standards and principles. But what does that actually mean practically? Well, when an aspiring architect joins our practice, I'll ask the architect to test 4 key capabilities against all of their designs, because I think they're really important from a Salesforce perspective. The first one is scalability. We need to design our apps to work as well for 1 or 1,000 users. And we need to have a point of view in mind as to how we can extend that to 1 million users if we needed to. Secondly, innovation. Pay attention to the trends in the market, because that latest trend that might feel like it's come straight out of a sci-fi novel, it will be matured and on the App Exchange before you know it. So pay attention to what the market is saying and have a point of view on how you can apply that to your architecture in the future. Third, security. Security is the cornerstone of all good software architecture. So pay attention to it and apply security by design principles. When I'm looking to get a yardstick test against my architecture, I will refer to the Open Web Application Security Project, which is a publicly available resource online which you can Google and will help you test your architecture. Finally, enterprise compliance, and I think this is really important. So I know we're all Salesforce architects in the room, but Salesforce exists as one of a sea of applications in a state. So design responsibly. Think up and downstream of Salesforce and respect your organization's master data flow. You'll really increase your credibility as an architect if you keep square pegs in square holes in your architecture. Okay, so now we're thinking like an architect, let's look at the first tool. And the first tool is the system landscape. And the system landscape matters because it's your first picture of how your application will interact with the organization and its users. It gives you up and downstream context, and it will start to help you identify what might you break. Is there anything else in your architecture performing a similar role that you need to be aware of? And finally, it will help you to start mapping your interfaces. So get your interface catalog at the ready, because this will be your first picture of the interfaces that you need. From a formatting perspective, I always like to logically group my system landscapes to make it easy for people to read and understand the data that's important to them. And the 4 groupings that I create start with users. I'll try and indicate where the external users and the internal users interface with my applications. Next, apps. I like to present the apps together that I'm integrating with, split into cloud and on-premise. Has anyone ever integrated a cloud and an on-premise app in the room? Yep? Fine. So you know there are challenges: security, opening firewall ports, performance. So I like to group them together so you can start to de-risk your architecture and understand the places that you need to investigate. So here's an example system landscape. And as we're Salesforce architects, I think it makes sense to me to put Salesforce front and center in the middle of your architecture. But what I do like to see is you call out the particular Salesforce clouds that you're using. So in this example, we're using a community, we're using Sales Cloud for our sales processes and Service Cloud for our customer service. But the Lightning platform also provides key services to us, like users, SAML, core objects like accounts and contacts. So I think it's important to call that out as well. Next, interfaces. I'm a stickler for detail on the interfaces. If you're going to interface with a system and it's an inbound and an outbound interface, that means 2 separate arrows on your diagram. If I see a single arrow with a pointed arrows on the end of it, I will assume that's a point-to-point interface. Next, I also think it's important that you include things that aren't necessarily integrated with your application. So here I've documented SharePoint Online, even though I'm not interfacing with it. And the reason that was brought out was because actually, in this example, all of the customer documents are stored on SharePoint, and we're not integrating with it. So when you're displaying your landscape, this might be a good discussion point to say to your stakeholders, do we need to consider Files Connect? Do we need to consider an interface to SharePoint because of what it will do to our user flows? So what's the so what of this artifact? When we've produced it, what does it tell our stakeholders? Well, first of all, it will start us to map out our user journeys. So let's take our external users as an example. Because we can see from our external users exactly where they'll be interfacing with us, we can see that they will access our data points and our brand through 3 possible routes. First, through the public website as an unauthenticated user, then through the customer community as an authenticated user, and finally, through SAP Fieldglass if they're a vendor. So the question to ask ourselves as architects is how do we surface the right data at the right time and make sure that the experience they get is common across those applications. It's also a good time to start talking about risk in the architecture. So for anyone who's ever integrated SAP with Salesforce, you'll know that it's fun. That's why I have grey hair. So it's important that you can call that out immediately and say, how do we de-risk the fact that we're integrating with SAP? Finally, I think the value of this landscape will be useful for context when you're discussing it with other architects in your organization, because it's a good time to start talking about reusability. Has somebody else integrated with the data lake through MuleSoft, and can you take advantage of that integration? Or are you about to create an integration that other applications are going to need, so you can be a responsible citizen and create your API for use elsewhere? Okay, so that was the landscape. Now it's time to talk about the data model. So data is your solution's most valuable commodity, so it's really important that you pay it close attention. As you start diagramming your data model, think, does your organization already have an enterprise data model that you can refer to that can give you a head start? Think as well, where is your company's master data? Sometimes it's really tempting to put your data into Salesforce because you can, but the question you need to ask is, should you? Where does that master data normally sit within your organization? So let's take a look at an example. This is a service-based company, and they are going to have a case process for managing service cases related to their assets. It looks fairly good. We've highlighted what the different objects are in a fairly clear way. We've called out the cardinality. It's a fairly decent data model. But how do we bring it to life and make it relevant to the user groups that we work with? Well, again, I like to use logical groupings, because the logical groupings can help us work through how we need to drive out the decisions around where the data is stored and where do we take it from. The first example on your right-hand side is related to users. So we can see here from this user, team, and business unit that this data might come from an HR system. So this will be a good set of objects to discuss with your HR people or perhaps your service desk team dealing with Active Directory who might have this information. Similarly, look at the contact. We have the contact called out with event and task. This is grouped because it's all going to be personal data. So this might be a good time to have a conversation with your compliance team to understand about your data life cycles and how you should handle the data within those objects. And as well as logically grouping, let's also think about what other assets we can add onto this data model. We can call out where the data is mastered. So with an M or an S, we can say whether the data is a master or a slave in Salesforce. Again, get out your interface catalog, because if you don't have an interface that's interfacing with one of these objects and giving you the data you need to add a new interface onto your interface catalog. Finally, if any of you have already got an existing Salesforce org that's got a lot of objects and a complicated data model, Lucidchart have released an add-in that integrates with Schema Builder and allows you to pull out your schema and put it into an EID format. So if you already have an existing data model that's quite complex, that's going to save you a hell of a lot of time. So in terms of the data model, what are we communicating to our business with the data model? Well, first of all, we can have a great conversation with our business about what information can we give them, what reporting, what insight, what analytics can we give the business. We can also provide validation on our interfaces. Do we actually have the right data flows coming into our organization? And is the data going to persist in the areas we expect? And finally, data migration challenges. So in this example, with the account and the contract, We're going to be migrating data from source systems to Salesforce. What if there's 5 different systems and we need to merge all of the account records, wash the data? It's a good time to start identifying those challenges. Okay, next, everyone's favorite Salesforce topic, Salesforce Limits. In my opinion, Salesforce Limits are the bread and butter of a Salesforce architect. It does no good for your credibility if you do not understand limits well. So make this something that's in the forefront of your mind throughout your designs. I see limits are split into 2 distinct groupings. First of all, those limits in your Salesforce contract. So those things that your organization has purchased, like your feature licenses, your users, the edition. That will help drive out information like the possible number of API calls you can make or the data that you can store. Next, platform limits. This will be the Salesforce governor limits that are commonly referred to. This will be where Salesforce has got hard limits in place that you need to make sure you respect and you don't go over and you factor into your design. So what are the Fab Four Limits that I like to see people referencing? Well, first of all, data storage. And the good news about data storage is it's quite easy to calculate. As I described before, if you know your edition and you know the number of users you have, you can make a calculation on the possible data storage you'll have in your org. Data storage is calculated based on 2 kilobytes per record, so it's easy to make a calculation to predict how much data you will store in your org. But the key thing about data storage, again coming back to the scalability point I made right at the start of this presentation, count on a year-on-year basis. How much data will you use in year 1, in year 2, and year 3? And as we were taught at school, show you're working. If you can show how you've made that assumption, whether it's because you will roll out to 1,000 users next year, or your business is going to grow by another 10%, make sure your stakeholders understand how you made that calculation, so it's completely transparent to them. Licensing. I've got some bad news. Salesforce licensing is not cheap. So it's really important you pay attention to your licensing and think, how will the licensing model scale with your organization? One of the early mistakes I made was I forgot to include service accounts in my calculation. So I had an integration that was inserting data into the opportunity object. I hadn't assigned it a feature license. We needed to buy a feature license for that account. So think of all of your service accounts, not just your user accounts. Next, APIs. APIs are very similar to your data storage limits in that based on your Salesforce contract, you should be able to calculate the number of API limits that you'll consume. Personally, I always start with my interface catalog. I look at my inbound APIs and I start to make my calculations from there. Another key thing not to forget is any services you have running in your org, like backup or archiving. They will be consuming inbound API limits, so make sure you include them in your calculations. And finally, governor limits. So governor limits is a really broad topic and I don't have time to go into it here in detail. But what I think is important about governor limits is interpreting the requests from the business that are coming in the shape of requirements and early identifying whether they are going to be at risk of hitting governor limits. For example, a user asks you to query data and the query is really wide. Well, there are many different SQL limits that we're at risk of hitting with a wide query. So send the requirement back, get it elaborated, and make sure that query is as narrow as possible. Okay, good governance, your design decisions log. So as a Salesforce architect, you will make design decisions frequently, and you'll make very important design decisions, excuse me, that could affect your solution for years to come. So it's really important to document those decisions well and make them transparently available to the business. From a design decisions perspective, there are 4 steps that I walk through on any decision. First of all, I identify the decision. What is it that we're trying to solve? Secondly, what should we do? Our recommendation. Third, let's make sure we list alternatives if we think there are alternatives that people should be aware of. And finally, document the decision clearly and in plain English. The decision that's made might not be the same as either the recommendation or the alternative. So make sure you pay as much attention to documenting the decision as you do the previous parts of the log. So let's play through a design decision that I took recently in an org. So the problem was we want our data encrypted at rest. Decision required, use classic or enhanced encryption. Category, security. Relations, all of our security guidelines and our data storage principles. Our recommendation was stick with classic encryption in Salesforce. The justification, number 1, our security policy mandated that 128-bit encryption was fine. And number 2, we use Marketing Cloud with a standard connector, and that is not compatible with enhanced encryption. Assumptions. We assume it will be acceptable to our security team to sign off the fact that standard fields and files are not going to be encrypted at rest if we use classic encryption. Alternatives. Purchase Salesforce Shield Platform Encryption, which will encrypt all fields and files up to 256-bit. Implications. We'll need to build Marketing Cloud custom integrations, and we'll need to purchase the additional 10% of our licensing cost for the Shield Platform Encryption license. Decision made. Go with the classic encryption, and then we clearly called out named, not a team, the named person who made the decision, and the date that they made that decision. So what does our design decisions log communicate? Well, I think it's really important because it shows auditability. It will help give your stakeholders confidence that you are auditing the work you are doing and giving them a regular chance to review your work. It will show that you're in control, but it's really important to be disciplined with your design log. Review it regularly, make sure the right stakeholders attend those review meetings, and make sure you and your team are using the design decisions log consistently. And finally, transparency. Give your stakeholders every opportunity to review the design decisions log. Make sure that they don't see architecture as sitting in some ivory tower where no one really knows what they're doing. The design decisions log is your chance to be transparent. The final tip I'd say on design decisions, provide traceability through your other artifacts that you create as an architect. So if you, for example, created a detailed design document, it referred to your security policy. Create traceability to the design decision I just spoke about with regards to security and data at rest. Okay, the final, the final tool that I want to go through is not an architectural tool necessarily, but it's about how we tell our solution's story. And why I think this is important is because when you're an architect, you will have your heads down in the detail of your solution. And in fact, when you do that, you will understand more about your solution and its context than anyone else that you present to. So don't forget the fact that you will know more about anyone else about your solution. So construct your story. Abstract the right level of detail for the stakeholders you're presenting to, and convince about your design. You may be presenting to people who are cynical about Salesforce or not sure that your solution will work. So make sure you're prepared to stand behind the design decisions that you've made. Storytelling principles. So this is how every good story should be told. You start with the why, you then go through the method and describe the how, and then you finish with the solution. The mistake I made when I first started being an architect was I used to go straight to solution, to the what, and it didn't give the stakeholders the context or the confidence that they were informed enough about the decisions I was asking them to make. So let's start our story with the what, and we'll see how it sounds. The solution automatically provisions and deprovisions users based on AD using SAML and populates manager and business unit details via a nightly feed from HR systems. This removes manual work. I don't know what anyone else thinks, but I'd say, so what? What does that mean? What decision are you asking me to make? Is that a good idea or a bad idea? I don't know, because you didn't give me any context. So let's try it again. Let's start with the why, and let's work it through. Our business has a high proportion of temp workers with high volumes of staff movement, manual processes to create users, and to update their manager information from HR systems. This is wasting our sales managers' time and stopping them selling. We explored where the master data for our employees sat and understood the order of execution in which those systems were populated. AD can provide us with our core attributes that we need to create a user and to record whether the user is active. Our HR systems are updated on a near daily basis by our local HR teams who will inform us of the manager and the hierarchy information. So the solution automatically provisions and deprovisions users based on AD using SAML, and populates manager and business unit details via a nightly feed from HR systems. This removes manual work. Does that sound better? Fine. And then when you're telling your story, abstract the detail. I think that's a really important point as well. If you're from a development background or an admin background, you'll be used to concentrating on the detail. Have you written your query as technically sound as you could? Have you made sure you're not consuming particular limits, etc., that might be important in the context of your low-level design? But when you're presenting architecture to your stakeholders, you need to abstract the right level of detail. The best architects I have worked with can describe complex problems simply, and it will really help you get a level of understanding from your audience. There's an interesting study from the American Press Institute about storytelling, and they looked at telling the same story in different ways. When they told that story with sentences with words per sentence, an average of 8, they had a 100% comprehension rate from their audience. When they increased the number of words per sentence to 14, the comprehension rate was still around 90%. But after that, it kind of fell off a cliff. And when you get to 40 words per sentence, the level of comprehension is less than 10%. So it's really important that you describe concisely what you're trying to communicate. And finally, my favorite part of architecture, convincing. This is where you can really come to life. Convincing your audience is not about the most architecturally pure design or the most technically assured solution. It is about getting across your message and making sure that your stakeholders understand. So use whatever tools and methods you think will work. Paper, post-it notes, make them stand up to represent your landscape diagram, smoke signals, whatever you think is relevant. Just make sure that you communicate your message successfully. So as you plot your architecture steps, the key thing I would say is be ready to listen and learn. And working with an experienced architect will really help that. At Capgemini, we have an aspiring architect program that will pair you with an experienced architect on your day-to-day project work. In addition, we also pair you with a mentoring architect. And the mentoring architect is either a CTA or somebody very close to completing their CTA assessment. And they'll be able to help you with your career and how you can develop your career. If you're interested, please speak to me afterwards or connect with me on LinkedIn. To close, as you embark on your journey into architecture, here are the things that help me. So number one, learning from experienced architects. They have the trusted tools and methods, so be prepared to listen and learn. Secondly, never stop questioning your designs. Question what are they telling your stakeholders and what are the important information that, for example, your landscape diagram is giving you. And finally, be confident. You will know more than all of your stakeholders about Salesforce and probably all in the organization about your solution. So be confident with your designs and show your confidence by abstracting the detail and parking the detail in your back pocket if you need it later. Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions? I think we've got 1 minute. Architecture in 1 minute. Come on, it's easy. No? All right, thank you, everyone.